Ačiū labai. Thank you. Yes, the original discussion was that it's an update on Francis. But he's been in the office for 9 years, much longer than he expected to be, and so I don't know if there's much of an update to give. There actually is. But I began to realize in preparing that as Francis goes on, he's becoming more and more controversial. And I think it's reflective of the society that we live in, that everywhere we look, there seems to be polarization. And we're seeing that in the church, and in particular in attitudes towards Pope Francis. So as I thought about it, I said, it might be good to try to understand this whole thing of the papacy and the popes as a bigger picture. And maybe from there to begin to understand the successes and the struggles that a particular pope like Francis has. Because some of his struggles or controversies are based on who he is as a Jesuit. If he were a Franciscan, there wouldn't be these problems. But he also comes as somewhat, and I'll say more about Francis later, but somewhat as an outsider. Not totally, but somewhat as an outsider. And so he comes with a different cultural, theological perspective, and also a very different perspective on the world. So to understand who these popes and the papacy are, or have been, I'm getting messages on my thing, I'm wondering why they're showing up here, but you're not seeing them, so I'm okay. It all goes back to the very beginning, actually, when Peter and Jesus are having a discussion, and Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" And they're saying, "Oh, you're this person, you're that person, this person." And he looks to the disciples and say, "But who do you say?" And Peter comes out with the confession of faith, the profession. You are the Christ. And that's when Jesus says, "You're my man. You're the rock." This passage from Matthew 16. "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Jesus gives Peter authority. And it comes out of his profession of faith, that he recognizes who Christ is, symbolized in these keys, which give you the ability to open or close. And I don't know if anybody has ever known a janitor of a property. I have a friend who's a janitor in Wisconsin. He's retired now. But he was the man of power in the school because he had the keys for everything. You didn't move anywhere unless you had keys. He let you in. And so that is the symbol of keys. We'll see the keys will show up in many pictures of with Peter in particular, but also with the other popes, the other people who fall what we call in the Apostolic Succession. The Pope who lays hands on bishops and they get laid hands down. And so we talk about the Apostolic Succession. This is part of the authority that gets passed down. So when we look at the authority of the Pope, it goes right back to Peter, all because of this profession of faith and the handing on of the keys. Also with this authority, we get into the whole question of papal infallibility, which most people don't understand, because some people think everything the Pope says is infallible, and that's not true, and the Pope would be the first person to tell you that. In fact, throughout the history of the Church, there are only 2 statements of papal infallibility. They have to be made from the seat, sede. In Greek and Roman philosophy and history, you sat on the seat and you taught from the seat. So it has to be done from the seat of Peter. He can't be out in Philadelphia and say he's infallible. It has to be from the seat, from his place in Rome. And he also has to publicly say it. This is infallible. So Pope Francis has yet to say that ever, that he is infallible. Pope Benedict never said it either. Neither did John Paul I or II, neither did Paul VI. We have to go back a little to the dogma of the Immaculate Conception and the dogma of the Assumption of Mary. Two dogmas of Mary are the only two infallible statements of popes. And that is it. That should tell us that no matter what we think of whatever pope we're talking about, all of them are pretty smart people. They understand that the world changes. And it is very scary to begin declaring things as infallible. But they still have authority. They recognize that they too are sinners, they can make mistakes, but they have authority. So we know who the first pope was, Peter. And he died somewhere between 64 and 68. Who was the second pope? Wow. That's why you know, huh? So yes, Linus was the, wrong picture, I'm sorry. So yes, the second pope was Linus. And he was pope from 67. Many people say that Peter was martyred in 64. But all the records of the Vatican that they have Linus coming in as pope in 67. So that's why they look at the death or martyrdom of Peter between 64 and 68. It probably should have been Paul, frankly, but Paul was dead by 65. And Paul is actually the one who identifies Linus as the Bishop of Rome. And that is very important as a title. So Linus is bishop for 13 years, and there is one interesting thing that he is known for. I'm sure there's others, but there's one thing that I found of interest. He put out the regulation that women should cover their heads when they come to church. So if you wonder how far that goes back, all the way back to 67. 0067, not 1967. So Linus. Throughout time, we've had different titles for the Pope. We know that from the beginning, Jesus didn't say, Peter, you are going to be the Pope. He called simply Peter the rock. Now you think about that as the foundation, strength. This is who the Pope is. But we also know Peter as the one who denies Jesus 3 times. So even though he's the rock, he's also human. And he's a sinner. Since the beginning, the Pope has been referred to as the Bishop of Rome, for that is who he is. In the beginning of church history, the bishops were regional leaders. So churches began in home churches, family churches, where usually the mother or grandmother was the leader of prayer. And then it moves out to a public arena, out into the public. So that's where you had priests. And the reason they were men was because the public arena was a male-dominated patriarchal society. The home was matriarchal. Publicly it was patriarchal. And so men were in charge. And so regionally, men were chosen to be the leaders of a region, and we called them bishops. So the leader of the region of Rome was a bishop. The way the Bishop of Rome was chosen after Linus is that local leaders, or oftentimes local other bishops, got together and decided who was going to be the Bishop of Rome. Keep that in mind as we think about how popes are elected. That they are the Bishop of Rome, and that comes from the 1st century. Another title is Pontifus Maximus. If I was ever Pope, that's the title I would like to be used. Though it really doesn't, the Latin sounds so much more majestic. Pontifus Maximus. And it means the great bridge builder. Another is Summus Pontifex, Roman title which means the high priest or the highest priest. Again, Rome. By the 5th century, we're seeing the title Vicar of Christ, the representative of Christ in the world. You begin to see a change in the understanding of the role of the bishop. By the 6th century, the Italians start calling him Papa, Father. And from that we get Holy Father, which is a title we still use today. It's probably the most famous popular title, Holy Father. 7th century with Gregory the Great, he wanted to be known as the servant of the servants of God. Servant of the servants of God. In 1929, with the founding of the Republic and the Concordat with Italy and the Vatican's formation of the Vatican city-state as we know it today, he's known as the sovereign of the Vatican City. But if you ever meet him, you don't call him any of this, you just simply say, His Holiness. And he'll be fine with that. Actually, there people have said when they meet with Pope Francis, he has been asked to be called Bishop Bergoglio at times. To each his own. I would go Pontifus Maximus. So how many popes have there been? Officially 266. 266 men have sat in the seat of Peter. Well, actually not the seat of Peter. Where they think it is, it's up in the St. Peter's in this big bronze thing. There might be a chair of Peter in there. But they've been recognized as the Holy Father. 266. But here's the interesting part. One from Poland. We know who that was. In all those years. One from Argentina. 217 from the peninsula of Italy. I think that's like 80%. That says something about the papacy. If 217, 80% of the popes over 2,000 years have been Italians, it says something. Some quick facts or statistics about popes. The youngest pope was actually 20 years old. In 1032, poor guy Benedict IX, chose the name Benedict IX, he was only 20 years old. The oldest elected pope was Benedict. The oldest elected, he was 78 when he was elected. The shortest papacy, we were talking earlier about John Paul I. Poor man lived 33 days, had to check out. But there was one who only lived 13 days. Urban VII in the end of the 16th century. 13 days. So when I heard that, I said, I want to find out how he died, because I thought for sure you're looking at 1590. The church is having some struggles around that time. I thought, accidental death. But no, he actually died of malaria. Those mosquitoes in Rome will get you every day. Be careful. The oldest living pope, or the oldest person who was ever pope, would now be Benedict. He's 95 years old, and there's no pope that has ever lived till that age. So if you count him, even though he's emeritus, he'll be the oldest pope ever so far. The oldest pope to die in office was actually only 2 years younger than him, 93. That was Leo XIII. Died in 1903. The coat of arms. Every pope has a coat of arms. Actually, I thought they went back a lot earlier than that, but it really comes out of the medieval ages, and probably with the Crusades and things like that, you had to have a shield. And so the first pope to have a coat of arms was Innocent IV back in the 13th century. And some quick things about Francis before we get into some more detail. He was the first non-European. He was the first pope from the Americas, particularly the first pope from Argentina. He was the first Jesuit. There have been three Franciscans. He was the first Jesuit. He's currently 84 years old, but he was 76 years old when he was elected. And he frankly spoke openly that he would not serve more than 5 years. He was wrong on that. God has other plans for him. We get to Pope Francis. I'll talk a little bit about these. He's sending out hints that he may retire and stuff. He was talking in Canada freely and stuff. I'll give you my idea on that. What I'd like to do now is just to spend a few minutes going through what I would call some of the modern day popes to help understand who the popes were or have been, because it helps us again understand who Francis is and why he is, I believe, controversial. So I'll begin with Pius XII. He was born in the 1876. He was a Roman. He was, they say, a Roman's Roman. He was very Roman. Born, raised, died, spent much of his life in Rome. He was ordained at a young age of 23. Immediately he went to work for the Secretary of State at the Vatican, right after ordination. Says something. By the time in 1917 he was an Apostolic Nuncio in Munich, and then in 1920 he becomes the Nuncio of the new German Republic. So he's very connected with Germany. He knows the language, he knows the culture, he lived there for many years. So when war breaks out or the Nazi movement grows, he's already familiar with it. He knows what's going on. In 1929, he's called back to Rome and he is made Secretary of State, which is kind of like the COO of the Vatican. He is made a cardinal when he is brought back, which often happens. And in 1933, he works on the Holy See's Concordat with Hitler's Germany. He works on the agreement between the new Germany of Hitler and the Vatican as a city-state. Interesting, in writings that are now just being released, Pope Francis opened up the archives to allow scholars to look at the writings of Pius XII, partly because they're trying to understand his place during World War II and during the Holocaust. But they found that already immediately after being part of putting that document together, he basically was telling people, this isn't going to work. This isn't real. This is not what Hitler wants. 1933, he was already saying that. In 1936, he actually made a visit and visited with Roosevelt in the United States. In 1939, he becomes Pope. Some of the things that he is kind of known for is he liked to use the radio. He did a lot of radio messages. And even at the beginnings of the Nazi movement and the beginnings of World War II, he was already on the radio talking about the need for peace in the world and trying to just form a different mentality. That was his mindset. On August 24th in 1939, he put out a radio announcement, and the end of the announcement was, remember that nothing is lost with peace and everything can be lost with war. This is August 24th, 1939. August 31st, he does an exhortation to England, to France, throughout Germany, Italy, and Poland. And he says, maintain peace, work for peace, work hard for this. August 31st. And you know what happens September 1st? Hitler invades Poland, beginning of the Second World War. So already he had a feel for what's happening, and he knew it was wrong. Something's wrong. Throughout the war, he is known for working much with refugees, also with helping Jews, somewhat with hiding Jews at the Vatican and other convents throughout Italy, throughout Rome. He was also, at that time, you got to remember, popes weren't recognized like they are today, and we didn't have media to follow them, so they could get out of the Vatican fairly easily and not be noticed. So when there were bombings going on near Rome, he would oftentimes go afterwards and minister to those who may have been injured in the bombings around Rome. So he was very hands-on, though if you notice, he was a diplomat, working as part of the Secretary of State from the beginning, working as a nuncio. In Rome, there is this, they call it the Diplomat School. So certain priests, as part of their formation in the seminary, are put into the Diplomat School, and they become part of the nuncios, the apostolic nuncios. They all know each other. Eventually, many of them become bishops and archbishops, cardinals, and even popes. The early part of this diplomatic corps was really what Pius XII was part of. He's born as Pacelli and known very much as Pacelli. I know a lot of friends from Rome, Americans who studied in Rome, when they make reservations at restaurants, they always use the name of Pacelli. I don't know why. That's what they like to do. So the end of the Second World War happens. The Americans are occupying Rome. There's some controversies that arrive with Pius XII in terms of what you may know the rat line. The rat line were hiding places or ways to get Nazis out of Europe via the Vatican and get them to Brazil, to Argentina, to different parts of the world, to get them out. And there's some controversy about whether he knew about it or whether he supported it. Actually, the friars, the building I live in was built after the Second World War. And the question arises, how did we get the property and where did the money come from? And there's controversies around that. My hope is that through the studies of Pius XII's archives, we're going to get to the bottom of a lot of this, just in the spirit of transparency. Because there are a lot of questions and a lot of stories and a lot of gossip going around. In 1945 already, so the war is over, the Soviets are moving in. He begins already in 1945 to speak against the Soviet style of occupation, in particular in the killing of civilians, the killing and imprisonment of priests in Slovenia and Croatia. He begins already, 1945. In 1954, do you ever wonder where the term Cold War comes from? It actually comes from Pius XII. He said, we are in a period when we are not in war, but we are not in peace. And he talked about that time that we call, and he called it the Cold War. It is a period not of war, but not of peace. And he was challenging people to open their eyes. A lot of I believe the controversy that comes with Pius XII in terms of did he support Hitler? Did he stand up? Why didn't he stand up to Hitler? Why didn't he say anything about the Holocaust? What did he know? I think historically we have to understand that the enemy of the church was communism. And so it was easy for them to partner without knowing the whole story with people who are fighting communism. And I think that shaped some of the reaction and the response, and we have to understand it in that kind of that context. 1953, up to this time, to the 1950s, many in the church were very skeptical about technology. They thought it could be evil, could get people in trouble. The Christmas Eve message of 1953, Pius XII on the radio, names the possibilities of technology and talks about that there could be some goods here and we have to be open to this. This is towards the end of his papacy. So he's an older man who's still able to see broader and see, let's not negate all of this right away. I think that's something that we look for in popes, that they understand what's going on, but there's this prophetic vision that they're able to have. He is sick, quite sickly in the last few years of his life, and he dies in 1958 at the summer residence at Castel Gandolfo, and buried at St. Peter's in the Vatican. So, and I lost my... Then we move to the man that many people recognize, John the 23rd. He comes in 1958. He's born Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli in Bergamo, an area of Italy, in 1881. He also becomes immediately a secretary to a bishop. But World War I comes and he is pushed into service, and he serves as a military chaplain. After the war, after he finishes his service, I should say, he is then brought to Rome to work as part of the Propagation of Faith office, the society, or now we call it the Congregation for the Propagation of Faith, which is basically mission and evangelization. And so right away you could see he's part of the inner workings of the Vatican. He's part of the old boys club, in effect. He becomes an archbishop and is visitator to Bulgaria. He is the apostolic delegate to Greece and Turkey. And eventually, at the end of the war, becomes nuncio in Paris. He becomes very involved with UNESCO and the beginnings of UNESCO projects in France. He's brought back to Venice in 1953, where he is made cardinal. And at the death of Pius XII, Angelo Roncalli becomes John the 23rd when he is elected pope. People thought he was a short-term pope and that he wasn't going to do much. That he's going to just come in and live a few years and go on. But it's amazing what he begins to do. He comes with an attitude of something we heard about earlier today. Synods. He called the first synod of the bishops in Rome for the Diocese of Rome. He called the first ecumenical council, and we know that he called the first Vatican Council. So here was a man already up in years who they thought wasn't going to do much. And the first thing he does is, I want to sit and I want to listen to you. I want to hear what's going on. And some other neat stories about John the 23rd, Roncalli. When he was, again, it was difficult to recognize a pope on the streets. If Pope Francis today walked on the streets, people would recognize him. I remember after one of my visits with Pope Francis, and Mom had a picture of myself and Pope Francis on the piano, my nephew Eddie asked me one time, Uncle John, do you know the Pope? And I said, Eddie, everybody knows the Pope. If I showed you a picture of the Pope, Pope Francis, you would know the Pope. He said, oh, yeah, I guess so. I said, the real question is, does the Pope know you? And he looked and he said, well, does he? I said, I hope not. But at the time of John the 23rd, it would be easy to disguise himself and go out on the street, and that's what he did. He would dress as a peasant, and two sisters would sneak him out of the Vatican, and he would go walk around town. And the story goes, he would ask the people, so what do you know about the church? What do you think about the church? Because people were already stopping the experience and the participation in church. And John the 23rd wanted to find out what the people were thinking, so he would go out there and he'd ask people. And they didn't know who they were talking to. He looked like a peasant. And he would hear. The story goes that from what he heard, he discerned that he needs to call the Second Vatican Council. That the church has become irrelevant. 1958. Amazing. Unfortunately, he doesn't see the end of the Second Vatican Council, and he dies in 1963. local newspapers, the headline read, "Death in the Family." He was that loved by the people, especially of Rome. A death in the family. He was canonized by Pope Francis in 2014. When popes die, they are brought to, they can be buried anywhere. Some go back to their hometown, some go back to a diocese they served, some come back to Rome in any of the churches, basilicas that they served in. And if they're brought to St. Peter's, they're put in the basement, the tomb of the popes, until they get beatified, the second step to becoming a saint. Then they get dug up and moved upstairs. So John the 23rd is upstairs. Now, John the 23rd, John the 23rd is upstairs. John Paul II has been moved upstairs. And all the popes who have been made saints have been moved upstairs. Paul VI. So the Second Vatican Council is in its third session. It hasn't been completed. John the 23rd has died, and so now the cardinals have to get together and they choose Giovanni Montini to be their next pope. Montini was born at the end of the 19th century, again an Italian from Brescia. Immediately begins to work after ordination as an attaché in the nunciature in Warsaw. He eventually comes to work at the Secretary of State. He moves up the ladder from substitute to the Secretary of State, and eventually gets made the Archbishop of Milan, the largest archdiocese, seen as a stepping stone to many other things, the Archbishop of Milan, and there he becomes cardinal. He's elected pope in 1963. I think he's probably one of the greatest popes of the 20th century because of what John the 23rd started and what the bishops and experts talked about. Paul VI had to carry out. And I think that was his legacy, that he was able to take the work of the Vatican Council and to begin to implement it. The most famous work of Paul VI was probably Humanae Vitae, a document where he put out on the value and dignity of life. In particular, the most controversial part was the part talking about contraception. And the reason I bring that up is because as we talk about the next pope, that topic of contraception comes up. Paul VI had 2 or 3 different drafts of that section of Humanae Vitae. And he was leaning towards a more liberal approach on contraception, but felt that there was no way that he could get the bishops in Rome, the cardinals in Rome, to go along with it. He was being influenced largely for a more liberal approach to contraception by a man by the name of Albino Luciano, who he considered a friend and a colleague. Many of you know Paul VI because he was a pope for a number of years. Interesting, 40 years of his life as a bishop and a cardinal were in Rome. I say that as a significant piece of how do people work in Rome. How is it that Francis can work in Rome? When you look at these people like Montini, Pacelli, these were Romans. They were Italians. They knew the system. They knew how it works. And for somebody like Montini, who was Paul VI, to do 40 years from working up from being in the Secretary of State to becoming Pope, 40 years in Rome is pretty remarkable. He is also the beginner of the World Day of Peace, so peace was very much on many of the Pope's minds. He died in 1978. In 2014, he was beatified and moved upstairs. No. Paul VI has the most simple tomb in the basement of the popes, the tomb of the popes. And he stays there. Because in his last will and testament, he said, no matter what happens, I want to be put in the ground at St. Peter's and never brought out. And they have honored that, surprisingly. I find it surprising because The treasurer of the Franciscans, before I became treasurer in 1990, once told me, when they're alive, you promise them everything they want. When they die, you do whatever you have to do. Paul VI got what he wanted, even in death. So, he leaves Humanae Vitae, he dies. He has quite remarkable papacy, if you read the story. Then, in 1978, we get who's called the Smiling Pope. The Italians loved him. He was from an area near Venice, Forno di Canale, born in 1912. Basically a pastor. And he spent his whole life up there around Venice as a pastor, then as a bishop, as an archbishop, and even as cardinal. This is a break in tradition. Because all the previous guys all were part of the mechanism of the Vatican. They were working there. John Paul I, Albino Luciani, was not even educated in Rome. He was educated in Venice. So he was really the first outsider. Maybe that's why he only lived 33 days. Just saying. So in 1978, with great ceremony, I mean, Paul VI had been very sick the last few years of his life, and he looked weak, and he wasn't seen much, and all of a sudden you have this vibrant, smiling Pope who comes out. And people loved him. The Italians loved him. 33, I remember where I was. I was in school in New York, and I was at the College of Insurance, where I had, most of my friends there were Jewish for some reason. It's just that's who I hung out with. And I remember when Paul VI died, and we were talking about, they were asking about the Pope and stuff like that, and I told them stories. I didn't know if they were true or not, but you know, I was 18 years old, so I just told them what I thought was right. 30 days later, I come to class, and I'm sitting down, and they say, "Oh, you're going to get a new Pope." I said, "No, we got one already. He's been there for about a month." They said, "No, he died." I said, "No, you're kidding me." I said, "My Jewish friends told me that the Pope died. I didn't even know that." When John Paul was, as a cardinal, he was coming to Rome, he was approached by many of the cardinals that he should be the next Pope. And he said, "I will not accept." He kept saying that, "I will not accept." Then they confronted him after he accepted, and they said, "Sometimes the obligation given by others is more important than my own will." So he took the job as an obligation. But the Holy Spirit has called him to this, and that's why he's taking the job. He had a couple things that he wanted to work on: to revise canon law, to further implement the changes in the Vatican II, to promote church unity. He wanted to promote dialogue, always to encourage world peace. These were the things that he was always talking about in those 33 days. When they found him in his room, they say that there was a copy of Humanae Vitae there in his desk. And the legend is that he was really working on bringing back documents that he wrote when he was a bishop in Venice and doing a revision on Humanae Vitae. He felt that we had to revisit as a church the teachings on contraception. When he was made bishop, when he was made Pope, he's the first one who got rid of the coronation idea. It used to be popes were coronated, and he's the first one who got rid of that. So he didn't wear the crown, and he didn't call the celebration a coronation. He called it an inauguration, and he asked to be given another pallium. The pallium is, an archbishop is given a woolen cowl, like that has usually a tug in the front and the back, and it's a sign that they are the shepherd. Interesting, our Anglican chaplain talked about the staff of the shepherd as a sign of being the shepherd for the chaplain. The archbishops get this pallium. There's going to be consistory, a meeting for making new archbishops at the end of this month, the 27th. Making new cardinals. I'm sorry, that's not the archbishops, it's cardinals. Archbishops are made at the Feast of Peter and Paul. So they get this collar, and that's what he wanted to be a symbol, not the crown. As we know, he died 33 days later. He was seen as a very human Pope, happy. I include the second picture on the page there because the church had a certain image, and it was, I think, the bishop standing there in the background. And the contrast to that image was John Paul I standing in the foreground. Then we moved to another pope that many of us got to know very well because he lived as a pope for many, many years. What's that? What did we figure out? That's 33 years, something like that. So we had John Paul I was brought in. He was not part of the establishment, brought in from the outside. And then we have now John Paul II, who's Karol Wojtyła, the first and the only Polish pope to be brought in, Polish cardinal to be brought in and made pope. Born in 1920, by the time he's 21 years old, his mother has died, his father has died, his brother has died. He goes in to avoid being drafted into the army. He works in the quarry, in a chemical plant. He gets ordained at the end of the war. He gets ordained in 1946. He becomes a university professor, and eventually becomes Bishop of Krakow. Becomes eventually Archbishop, and then the Cardinal, and he's elected Pope. We know that there was an attempt on his life in 1981, which he survived. It's only 3 years after his, I want to say coronation, but inauguration as Pope. And there's a lot to be said about John Paul. He was a traveler. He traveled to more countries than anyone because it was easier. He made a lot of saints. It used to be that to be a saint, you had to wait 100 years after their death to start the process. And the idea was to let any kind of little scandal things get forgotten. But with Mother Teresa, no one ever could find a scandal on Mother Teresa. So John Paul kind of pushed her thing before 100 years, and that has become kind of the tradition now. No one waits 100 years for someone to be, the process to begin to meet for saint. But he liked to make saints. I think 482 saints he made. Jubilee year, the 2000 was the Jubilee year, and he was already a pretty old man. I also show you the two images. I think we have this image of this vibrant young pope running around. He was very young when he was elected, and that's the one image. But then for how many years we had the image of him, in a wheelchair, barely able to speak, and I think that was a sad picture for the church, though I understand and have read about why he chose to live that way. He felt that the people needed to see someone like the Pope suffering, because it's the suffering of the cross that is part of our lives, the story of our lives. What else do I want to say about him? I'm going to move a little faster because I know I'm taking a lot of time. I got too much material for this. Benedict becomes Pope. What? So John Paul II dies in 2005. All of Rome was very sad. Again, here we have a pope who traveled a lot, was beloved by many people. The Jubilee year was a big year for him. People who knew him said he always said he wanted to live until the Jubilee year. He wanted to ring in the Jubilee. He lived 5 years longer. But that was a goal that he had personally, that he was going to live to the Jubilee. The other thing he's known for is World Youth Days. While there were World Youth Days in some form happening before John Paul II, he's the one who made them popular because he went. He showed up at a lot of World Youth Days, and that attracted people. He was a great evangelizer with youth, as well as with other people. The one scar on his papacy that we're still feeling, I think, today is the handling of scandals and abuses in the church. And not only the sex abuse, but also the financial scandal. There are stories that John Paul I made a point that he was going to restructure, reorganize this Vatican Bank, that he felt the Vatican Bank was scandalous in everything it was doing. Well, we call it the Vatican Bank, the Institute for the Operations of the Work of Religious. But it's really not a bank. It was more like a credit union type of thing. And there was a lot of scandal involved in it. And John Paul I apparently was on his list that he was going to address this. Some of you know the name Marcinkus, who was head of the Vatican Bank at that time. And there was rumor that John Paul I was going to remove him and put somebody else in charge of the bank. John Paul I didn't make it. John Paul II comes in, and John Paul II does nothing with the Vatican Bank. Part of it is that he was using the Vatican Bank to help fund the efforts against communism in Poland. And that's a proven fact. There's evidence to that. And so he didn't want to disturb what was happening there and didn't want to draw too much attention to it so that he could use that structure to fund the solidarity movement in Poland, or whatever it's worth. So Benedict XVI comes in, kind of unexpected but expected. Some people felt that we needed, that the church was getting a little loosey-goosey, we may say, about things, and they needed somebody law and order, and they actually called him the German shepherd when he was a bishop. Again, a German, and there weren't that many German popes. I think there were 6 German popes throughout history. He was actually ordained with his brother, interesting. He has a doctorate and he became a theology teacher. He has a doctorate in philosophy and theology, and he was a theology teacher. An advisor for the Archbishop of Cologne at the Second Vatican Council, so somewhat in the mix of the power of the church. He becomes the Archbishop and eventually the Cardinal of Munich. It was only that for a few years when they called him to Rome to be in charge of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, CDF. And this is the congregation where when there's scandals or problems, they get addressed there. That's where the courts get set up. This is where issues of faith teaching come in. This is where the catechism comes out of. So he becomes in charge of that entire congregation. He gets elected dean of the College of Cardinals. The College of Cardinals, I'll say a little bit more in a few minutes. But the dean is chosen from amongst the cardinals within 5 dioceses around Rome. And they choose who's going to be the dean, and he's kind of the coordinator, the head. He has some role when there's the death of a pope and things like that. He's elected pope in 2005, and actually is the pope in our history who is to resign. He's not the only one nor the first one to resign. People were kind of surprised. I think it was February 1st or 2nd. I got a call from Father Ostius in Lithuania. It was 3 o'clock in the morning for me in Wisconsin, and he calls me to say, "Did you hear the news?" I says, "No, I'm still in bed. It's 3 o'clock in the morning." And he says, "The Pope is resigning." I said, "You're kidding me, come on." And we actually found out that he did announce that he was going to resign. The question is why. You know, if you want to look at the story, the history of Joseph Ratzinger as Pope, he was definitely a more traditional person than John Paul, though John Paul was quite traditional. But he was more strategic. Have you read enough about works of the popes? I found John Paul II very difficult to read. He's too poetic. You know, for me, I'm a strategic thinker. He was too poetic. I like Ratzinger's work. Ratzinger was very strategic, very systematic. He was a systematic theologian, and he wrote very specifically. You understood. You didn't have to agree with him. Not that I always did or didn't, but he actually put out the new catechism. I'm skipping through a lot of things because I'm running long. He is known for things like the Latin Mass. He kind of opened up the opportunities for the Latin Mass to come back, and people appreciated that. He did come to the United States once, 2008, I believe it was. He was hit with scandals, 3 main ones. People felt the Vatican and he weren't responding to the sex abuse scandal as they should, and there's still a lot out on that, coming in around that. The financial scandal was going on, and he was trying to address it, but probably too connected with the people involved. And then the VatiLeaks scandal, the Butlers scandal, stealing the documents and releasing them, because the Vatican is very private and secret, and so they wanted to share all that information. The one thing I take away from Pope Benedict is in his document on love, God is love, I forget what year that was, he had a definition of faith. Faith is the liberation of my eye from its preoccupation with self. Faith is the liberation of my eye from its preoccupation with self. He claims that he resigned because of health. And if you look at pictures right about the time he resigned, he didn't look good. Today he's 95, so he looks 95. But a few years ago, he actually looked pretty good. He got his spunk back and stuff like that, so he actually looked pretty good. The story around Rome is that he retired or resigned because of the scandals. That he watched the last 7 years of John Paul II's papacy. And he saw John Paul coming out in a wheelchair and head drooling and everyone saying, well, there's the leader of the church. But you know that he isn't, that there's somebody behind the scenes who's doing the work. So who's responsible? And that Benedict's loyalty to the church, when he felt he couldn't get a handle on the scandals, he felt other people are running the show. And that's really why because he said, we need a younger person to do this work. And so that the reason is that he may have realized because of his loyalty, he wasn't a person who could address these scandals properly. And so he stepped down. The official story is that he stepped out because of his health. And that brings us to the man of the hour, the man of the day, Francis, the first Argentinian, born in 1936, a Jesuit. He was ordained. He taught literature. He was the provincial at the age of 37, I believe, provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina. And after his 6 years, some of the Jesuits say he was the worst provincial they ever had, that he was not involved with the Jesuits. He was doing his own thing. He's not a good administrator, and that he was more concerned about the poor than about the Jesuits. There was also during that time in Argentina, Buenos Aires, there were these dirty wars going on, the political scandals going on. Priests were disappearing, people were disappearing. He was able to get some of the priests back. The people didn't come back. The people disappeared forever. They were probably killed, and so people were going after him even as the provincial, saying, you're able to get your own Jesuits out, but you can't help the poor people anyway. They're being killed too. And so there was a lot of controversy about him and the Jesuits, even when he got out and eventually was chosen to be the auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires in 1992, and then the Archbishop and the Cardinal. He was always kind of a political anomaly for people. People who wanted something very specifically done, it seemed he couldn't do, but he was working on another level. There was always something secretive about what he was doing. He is known for his work with the poor, that he would ride the bus. He didn't have a car. He lived in a regular apartment, not in the cardinal's residence, and things like that. In 2013, he was elected Pope. So what can we say about this man, Pope Francis Bergoglio? As the Cardinal of Buenos Aires, he publicly stated he has 4 goals. And I think these are important to understand because I think these are his goals for all life in the church. The communities should be brotherly. He used the word brotherly. Communities should be brotherly. The way they interact, and that's the way they should be. He believed in an informed laity that should be leaders. The laity have to be informed and that they should be leaders in the church. He believed that all people should be evangelized. Don't preach to the choir. Evangelize all people. So go out to the periphery and find those who have fallen away from the church. Bring them back to Christ. Bring Christ back to them. And he had a real place in his heart for those who were sick, and particularly the poor, and wanting to spend time with the sick and the poor. I think that tells us a little bit about what his goal for himself as a pope is. what his papacy is about. He was elected I thought it was quicker, but he was elected on the second day, and I just recently read something. Now, I don't know how this gets out, because everything's supposed to be secret, it's supposed to be secret. He was elected on the 5th ballot. He was actually the favorite of the bishops going in, but the media never talked about him as a favorite, which was interesting. And I don't understand, because when Benedict was elected, the story has gotten out that he was the second in the running. And I think Benedict took 7 ballots to elect him. And Bergoglio was second in the running. That's interesting. Some stories about when he was elected. When someone is elected, first of all, they go up to see if they'll accept it, and if they say yes, then what name you will take. And he took the name Francis. When that was announced, everybody was thinking, oh, he's taking the name of Francis of Assisi. He's the first Francis, right? Taking the name of Francis of Assisi. I was sitting there thinking, no, he's taking Francis Xavier, because he's a Jesuit. Why would he take Francis of Assisi? Later on to find out, a friend of mine is Cardinal Hume, who used to be he's a retired bishop from Brazil. And he was sitting next to Francis, and he leaned over to him and said, as he was elected, said, don't forget the poor. And Francis claims it's at that moment he chose the name Francis, when he was told by Cardinal Hume not to forget the poor. Once you're elected, then you come to this place they call the Chapel of Tears. And it's where the newly elected Pope gets a few moments to kind of put himself together before he's presented. And then you come into the sacristy, and then the sisters have, they say, cassocks, papal cassocks in 3 sizes, because they don't know who's going to be elected, so small, medium, large. When I look at many of us in Rome, I don't even know if large would fit some of these guys, but small, medium, and large, I'm told, is laid out there. And then also a series of crosses, the pectoral cross that they wear. The story goes that he looked at the sisters and said, no, I'll just keep my own pectoral cross. And then they're giving him all this other stuff to put on. This red velvet and ermine and stuff, these things that they wear when they get dressed up, the popes. And the story goes that Bergoglio says, no, I think Carnevale is over. Because in Argentina they celebrate Carnevale, and that's when they all get dressed up. So people say cynically he was talking about the carnival of the church, but he claims that no, he was talking about the carnival back home. The time of the carnival is over, and that's why he wasn't going to get dressed up that way. Then they wanted him to put on new shoes, and if you ever seen him, he walks about. He's in a wheelchair a lot now, but he had these shoes that looked like Reebok walkers, comfortable shoes, and he's always worn them, but. The sister said, well, here's the shoes for you to wear. I think there were white ones, black ones, and red ones, because Benedict liked to wear the red ones for some reason. And he looked and he said, but sister, I just bought these shoes. Right before I came to Rome for this conclave, I said, I think I'll wear them because they really are pretty comfortable. So the sisters there got thinking that he's very human. And right away you begin to see this guy is different. And for many of us, that was a breath of fresh air. But for a place that is used to electing popes from Rome, from Italy, who've come through the system, this is scary. What is he going to say? That is the scary part. So then he comes out and he's announced as the new pope, and that place is going wild. The Argentinians in the crowd are going wild, and oh my God, this is the guy. And the story goes that the cardinals are in the back saying, I don't know what you're so crazy about. We knew this was going to happen. But if that's true, then why did it take 5 ballots? So there's stories on both sides. You kind of see what's going on. Then, the other remarkable thing, again, you begin to see his spirit. The people gathered there to get their first papal blessing. And first of all, the first thing he said was, good evening. And his Italian, he knew Italian, but not great. But he said, buonasera, good evening. And instead of giving a blessing, he asked the people to bless him. Now, for most people, that's not very remarkable. But when you think about it, who is there? The piazza, if you've seen the piazza, is packed. Who's there? Good Catholics. The sisters, the priests, they're there. Somewhat good Catholics. Easter and Christmas Catholics. Catholics who haven't been to confession or to church in years. Non-Catholic Christians. The Jews are there. The Muslims are there. Because all of Rome, this is a social event. It's not a religious event. Remember, he now is not only the Bishop of Rome, he's the sovereign of the Vatican City. He's bigger than this. He's bigger than the Catholic Church. And so everyone is out in the town square. And he asks them, the holiest of holy, the separated as most separated, the sinner of sinners, he asks them to bless him. To me, that's remarkable. It says how he recognizes his role as servant of the servants of God. Servant of the servants of God. So, the question is he conservative? Is he traditional? Is he a communist? Is he a socialist? Is he a Democrat? Is he a Republican? We know he's not Lithuanian. So I had an opportunity to be with a group of people where we asked him. I was part of the Conference of Major Superiors of Men a few years back, and we go every year to meet with people at the Vatican, and a couple of times we met with Pope Francis. One of the times was soon after he was elected. And we're sitting in his, 5 of us, sitting with him, and he's sitting in his little throne. And he had just come back from lunch, and to show his humanity, I'm looking at his white cassock, and it looks like he has spaghetti splashes, spaghetti sauce splash. I don't know, that's why brown is so much better. It doesn't show that spaghetti sauce splash. But you could see it on his thing, and he's sitting in his little throne, and we're sitting in chairs like this, and his chair is a little step higher. And at that time, he was speaking Spanish to us, and we had a Spanish interpreter. And so one of the guys with us, I think it was the Jesuit who was with us, asks, so, Holy Father, they say that you're a communist or a socialist. Well, how do you label yourself? And he has a good way of doing this when he wants to make a point. No labels. Don't use labels. Think about that, how often we use labels today. Don't use labels. When you place a label on someone, you stop all conversation. And isn't that true? There's no more discussion. Francis, if you want to say something, Francis is a man of dialogue. He wants to hear what people have to say. In that way, very much like John the 23rd. There's a story that Francis has a pizza parlor he goes to. I still can't figure out which one it is. But the story goes that he told the people if they ever tell anyone that he comes there for pizza, he'll never come back. But he has a room in the back that he goes for pizza. Just like John the 23rd. To be out with the people. When you see him in the hot sun in Rome, sitting during those audiences with 40,000 of your closest friends, and he's listening to the speeches, and he reminds me of teenagers. And then it comes time for him to visit with the people. And he's totally alive. He's invigorated. He wants to be with people. He wants to hear what people have to say. He wants to think it out. And he wants to talk to them, which gets him in trouble sometimes. Because he says things on the spur of the moment. And the press and we just take it. But he's Francis. So he's able to do that. I believe he is very dogmatic. He sticks to the teaching of the church, but he's also very practical. And he believes the way you balance practical life and dogma is through dialogue and discussion. And so he's willing to open up some of the things that we're afraid to talk about at times. Unfortunately, he's in the position of talking, and everybody thinks he's already telling you how it's going to be. But he's still talking, he's still listening. And I think that if we understand, that's not the Italian way, but that's the Argentinian way. The Italians want to know. The Italians want to know what the law is because they want to know how to work around it. That's basically how it works. He wants to share, let's figure out what's going on here. But when you get down to it, he's actually quite traditional. If you look at anything that he writes about abortion or clerical celibacy or ordination of women, he's very traditional. No question. He's very critical of capitalism, unbridled capitalism, consumerism, overdevelopment. He believes all of this denigrates the place of the poor. And he sees that as a great sin. Anything that destroys the dignity of a person, especially the poor, someone who's been outcast, someone who doesn't have power, who has no voice. He says that's a problem. And he sees that unbridled capitalism. Now, I use the word unbridled capitalism because that's where somebody else wrote it that way. I had an experience with him that I got this firsthand. Again, we're sitting there with the Conference of Major Superiors of Men. This was another time we were visiting with him, and he comes in and he's kind of laughing away, smiling away, enjoying the day. And he says, oh, by the way, I think I got some people disturbed from back in the United States. And we're like, oh, yes, you did? What are you talking about? And it was a couple weeks after Pope Francis said something about capitalism, money, and the United States. And a big donor at Notre Dame pulled out all their funding for a new dorm. It made the news. He said, if the church doesn't need my money, I'll give it to somebody else. So Pope Francis thought this was funny. So, and he was kind of laughing with us. Now, we're 5 male religious provincials from the United States, so okay, we could deal with this. And I spoke up. After all, I've been treasurer of, not the order yet, but of the province. And I have just been part of building a new high school in San Diego, 65 acres, $85 million. We raised a little bit of money. The church didn't give us any of that, by the way. We raised it ourselves. And so I said, Holy Father, the other 4 guys are looking at me like, John, zip it up. Don't say anything. This is not us sitting at dinner over a glass of wine. This is the Holy Father. And I said, but Holy Father, and this is all still being translated. His English, but the second visit was better, but he was still dealing with things in Spanish. I said, Holy Father, in the United States, we have a lot of wealthy people. In fact, we have a lot of wealthy Catholics. The mission is, the challenge is to connect the wealth with the mission of the church. That's the only way we get things done. And he fixed himself in his seat, and he looked at me, and he said, John. So I've been called out by the Pope. John. The interpreter sitting next to him goes, John, the hands and everything. I said, okay. He said, where I come from in Argentina, Buenos Aires, wealth is always connected with corruption. No exception. No exception. I think he said it 3 times. Maybe I have to listen to the other experiences. I was floored. But that's who he is. He's a man who's listening. He wants to hear. He doesn't want to be locked into the way we think it is. And that is invigorating, it's scary, and it's dangerous. But I don't think that bothers him. And it probably shouldn't. He's the Pope. I think that's okay. I think that's why when he, so we go out to dinner afterwards, not with the Pope, but just the 5 of us, and we're sitting there at the little restaurant down from St. Peter's, and one of the guys picks up the glass of wine and says, I'd like to toast to John, the one man sitting at this table who will never be a bishop. It's okay, I don't look good in red. I look much better in white. So, he advocates for things about climate change because he sees the interdependence. If you look at Laudate Si, if you look at Fratelli Tutti, he pushes for the interdependence of all creation, which is very Franciscan. Very Franciscan. And that's where some people sit there and say, where's he coming from? What doesn't he understand? He advocates for international diplomacy. He advocates for peace. He advocates for options for the poor and those on the periphery. In this last 2 weeks, he has actually had conversation with people who are advocating for LGBT communities. And this is happening in Rome, and I could just imagine how the Romans are reacting to this. I wish I was there to watch. He's always advocated for civil unions, even when he was cardinal in Argentina. But he doesn't advocate for same-sex marriage. Again, he's a man of dogma and practice. And through dialogue, he wants to come up with the solution that's right. So he doesn't believe that there should be sacramental marriage. And he has spoken like that. But he has also advocated for civil unions, for the government to do, to make people's lives better. And that's the way he says it. Very interesting. It's 1:45 already. Let me conclude that with Pope Francis. I have a lot of other little stories about Francis, but let me talk very quickly about what I said. My computer has frozen up. That's his coat of arms, by the way. Every pope has a coat of arms. His is the blue, the shield is really the coat of arms. The outside, almost all the popes use that as the outside, which is the crown, which he did not wear for the coronation. His was an inauguration. And of course the keys. The blue signifies for him the earth, the world, the universe, the very universality. The sun with the IHS and the cross on the top, that's the Jesuit symbols of Christ, the cross, and you have 3 nails at the bottom of the H there, if you could see very carefully. The sun is an ancient symbol for Mary, and they have a special word for that branch. I can't remember what it is, and that's an ancient symbol of Joseph. So he goes with the patronage of Mary and Joseph as his on his shield. The words on his as his motto on the end, it means mercy and being chosen. And it's taken from a homily of Saint Bede, and something about where Jesus calls the sinner, and out of mercy he calls him to follow him. So it's mercy and being chosen. That's what the 3 words at the bottom talk about. So the next pope. Does anybody know the qualifications for the next pope? There aren't many. No, that's an exclusion, I think. You have to be male. You have to have reached the age of reason, which is 7. So there was a pope who was 20. Remember that? And you can't be a heretic. That gets me out. But a practicing Catholic. That is it. No. Well, actually, no, this doesn't say. The thing is, the qualifications in practice are that since 1378, they've all come from the College of Cardinals. They choose one of their own. And that is not a rule, it's a practice. It has become that. And it's been a general practice that you know Italian, but that makes sense when 80% have been Italian. Bergoglio knew a little of Italian because he's of Italian background. His parents are from Italy. He was born and raised in Argentina. But it's interesting to note there's very few qualifications. There have been popes who were not priests, nor were they bishops, nor were they cardinals. And as soon as they elect you as a pope, actually there was a pope one time who wasn't even baptized. So they baptized you on the same day, They baptize you, confirm you, ordain you a bishop, and then you're ready to go. Simple as that. So very few qualifications. The College of Cardinals. Bishops have been chosen as cardinals since the 4th century under Sylvester, and first recognized. And the word cardinal basically means the hinge or the collaborator. They're seen as, by the 11th century, they become to evolve more as princes of the church, as special consultants to the Pope. And that's basically all they are. The difference between an archbishop and a cardinal is only that the cardinal has the ability to be the part of the College of Cardinals where the next Pope is chosen. But they don't have to choose someone from the College of Cardinals. So, and they become princes of the church. There is a dean who is one of the 5 dioceses near Rome, and they choose amongst themselves the dean who has a role in leading and coordinating for the cardinals. And there's a camerlengo who's basically the kind of the CFO. He's kind of in charge of the temporal affairs of the Vatican. He also has some roles. He's the guy who, when they think the Pope is dead, he goes, hits the Pope on the head with the hammer 3 times. They still do that, by the way, with the last Pope. They call his name. They hit you 3 times, they call your name to make sure you're dead. So they're basically considered parish priests, and they all are assigned a titular church in Rome. A church that when they're in Rome, that's where they can go celebrate as the parish priest. Some of the cardinals take that very seriously, and when they're in Rome, they actually go and do ministry in their titular parish. There are actually 3 degrees of cardinals. There are cardinal bishops, cardinal priests, and cardinal deacons. If you are a bishop in a diocese and you become archbishop and then a cardinal, you are a cardinal priest. If you are a bishop who's made a cardinal in an office in Rome, many of the offices are headed by cardinals, you become a cardinal deacon. If the Pope really likes you or you did something special, you could become a cardinal bishop. That's a special honorary title given by the Pope himself. There's no difference in what you can do as a cardinal in either of these roles. The only difference is the order that you walk in when you come together into any meeting or any church or anything like that. This signifies your order. So if you like to sit in the back of the church, you want to be a cardinal deacon and things like that. The College of Cardinals, when you elect the next Pope, Paul VI set the number at 120, that there would be 120 electors. To be an elector, you have to be under the age of 80. That's basically the only requirement. There's no test to see if you're mentally stable at 65 or not, but maybe they should have that test. But currently, as of July 12th, because I didn't know if anybody died since July 12th, there are 116 electors. There are 91 additional non-electors. That means over the age of 80. It makes 207 cardinals. Of that number 67 electors, Francis has appointed himself in the last 8 years. Now, if you think you need to have 2/3 vote to become Pope, this is where I think Francis is going to make his mark, by having more cardinals that he appoints, and therefore there's more of a chance that his vision continues. And that's why I think he planned to stay at least 5 years. He still doesn't have 2/3 at that, but at the end of the month, he's going to make 21 new cardinals, 5 of which are non-electors. That means they're honorary over the age of 80, and 16 that are going to be electors, possible electors, which raises his number to 83, except then the total number of electors comes to 132. So I don't know what they're going to do with that. And basically the rules for election can be written by the Pope himself, so he could change to whatever he wants. Basically, that can happen. Paul VI set the rules. John Paul II took away the limit of 120, but kept the age at 80. And Benedict dropped it again to 120, and the age is at 80. And so who knows what Francis will do. He hasn't changed it yet, but my guess, because he's up to 132, unless he expects 12 to go see God in the meantime, he's going to have to change the rules. Out of this new group, let's look at this real quickly, is I like to look at influence, power, and things like that. So 24% of the Catholic population is European, 40% of the electors are European. It tells us that we're still in that old model of 200 and some have been from Italy. We see in the North America, we have about 8% of the Catholic population, but we do have 13% of representation amongst the electing cardinals. South America, where the church is growing, it's up to 36% of the Catholic population, and it has only 12% of the representation. That says something about who might be the next pope. That's why I give you these numbers. I'm a numbers guy. I'm an actuary by trade. I'm a numbers guy. This is what I do. So, who will be the next pope? Very quickly. Let me get my... And I say this, Papabile is a constant conversation in Rome. Everyone always talks about it. And so you kind of hear who are the names being tossed around. Benedict was tossed around when John Paul II was getting more frail. Bergoglio was tossed around when John Paul II was frail, and also when Benedict announced his retirement. So this is just what happens. This is what they do. So these are 8 of the names that are being tossed around for your interest only. I have no, I'm not doing any kind of lottery or anything like that. But if somebody wants to, you're free to do this. One of the names is Oscar Andreas, and this is in no order. Oscar Andreas Rodriguez Maradiga from Honduras. He's 80 years old already, but he's always a top name. He is the head of the Council of Cardinals, the 7 cardinals who are the closest collaborators with Francis, so he's obviously on the page of Francis. The only thing that would get in the way, he's very connected with the Vatican bureaucracy, very inside right now. He actually was inside also with Pope Benedict. But I think his age might be an issue. Again, who knows how long Francis will be. Mark Quillet, a Canadian, who's 78 years old. He used to be a head of the Congregation of Bishops. And I think that's what got him up. He was the third to finish in 2013. So that means people, the cardinals of the world, were looking at him. Pietro Parolin is an Italian. He's 67 years old. He is currently Secretary of State. The problem is currently the Secretary of State is not looked upon favorably by many of the other cardinals because he has to make some tough decisions. And so who knows where that will leave him. Cardinal Robert Sarra from French Guinea. He's 77 years old. He was talked about when Benedict was elected. He was actually seen as a pretty high, if you don't want a European and the church is growing in Africa, this is a man you may want to go for. He's more of a Benedict-style pope, very much different in terms of his perspective than Francis is. Very connected with Africa and Asia. 4 more. Christoph Schönberg is from Austria. He is a Benedict-style pope, but is also very close with everything that has to do with dialogue with Francis. So he's seen as kind of a middle-of-the-road, kind of a compromise candidate. He's 77 years old. See where that gets him. A real popular name going around is Luis Antonio Taglia. He's from the Philippines. He's 65 years old. He's very vibrant. He's very charismatic, and he's considered young at 65. He is being pushed actually by Francis. So some people feel, is that good or bad? You know, if Francis has openly spoken about him as a possible candidate for pope. Another guy who's come up in the past is Turkson from Ghana, 74 years old, really a peace and justice guy. He doesn't seem to be that connected with Francis and his papacy, but connected with the issues. So I don't know what's going on there, what's really going on. And the final candidate that we hear being going around is Matteo Zuppi, who's from Italy, 67, and if the Italians feel that they need an Italian, he's probably the top candidate. But tomorrow he may not be. And that's the way it works. So it's interesting to see who Rome is talking about papabilia, as they say. So my question is, who is the next pope? It may be somebody young, it may be somebody old, it may be somebody from Italy, it may be somebody from Africa. Who really knows? The Holy Spirit will come out in all of this and somewhere give us some direction. And it might be a surprise for all we know. It might be a surprise. And the day will come when they will gather in the Sistine Chapel, and the doors will be slammed shut, and they will not allow to be, at least last time they weren't allowed to bring cell phones in. Apparently somebody snuck one in. One of the Americans, I heard, snuck one in. Leave it to the Americans. And we'll all stand outside and look up at the chimney on top of the Sistine Chapel, which is not permanent. Like when people come to St. Peter's Square and they say, you look at St. Peter's, then you look over to the right, and you see the top of the Sistine Chapel, and they say, well, where's the chimney? It's not there, because it's portable. They wheeled the stove in to the Sistine Chapel, and there's a trap door on the roof, and they put the chimney out, and you only see it when it's there. And then eventually somebody will stand up at the top of the balcony, the loggia, and then they will announce for us a new pope. And then the papacy and the popes will continue as they have for 2,000 years. And I think I've taken all my time and then some.
Masterful. Actually, we can. It's a great way to avoid questions because
But I like questions.
I know you do, but you managed to
Take you right to the last minute. I hope it gives you a little bit of a larger perspective on the papacy than just Francis, and to help to understand why Francis may at times seem struggling with the system, because he is an insider but an outsider, a powerful but has to learn how to do the politics of the Vatican. And I believe the choosing of the cardinals and will affect a lot who the next pope is, and will decide how the vision of the church moves on. So God bless you. Thank you very much.